Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, good evening. My name is Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and together, on behalf of myself and Chris Saines, director of the Queensland Art Gallery of Modern Art, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Perspectives Asia seminar. This is our first for 2022, and once again, we're online. We were hoping to be in person, but let's hope as we enter the Year of the Tiger that we'll be able to resume Perspectives Asia in person in the not too distant future. Now, to begin this evening and in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. For me, here in Brisbane, that is the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Recognising their wisdom, creativity and deep connection to country, I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge all of you in the audience this evening. We're really excited that you've been able to join us. And just looking through the list of attendees, it's so terrific to see support from across academia, and a special shout out to my colleagues from the Griffith Asia Institute, but also from industry, community, and from within Australia, but of course across the region. It's great to have you joining us this evening. So in bringing these seminars to you, we work particularly closely with our colleagues at the Galleries Centre for Asia Pacific Art. It's a genuine partnership and we're very grateful for it. And I'd like to just take a moment and extend my congratulations to Chris and the APT curatorial team led by Tarun Nagesh on a spectacular Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art that's going on right now. As the 10th iteration, it's not only remarkable in its breadth and depth in terms of the artistic work that it brings together and that it reflects from across the region, but also in demonstrating Quagoma's convening and staying power when it comes to cultural engagement with the nations, artists and communities of Asia and the Pacific. So a hearty congratulations. Our aim together, as many of you would know, through these seminars is to enable conversations that explore issues of contemporary culture, politics and society in our region. We felt really privileged to co-host a diverse range of speakers looking at a whole range of issues affecting Australia's relationship with its Asia-Pacific neighbours. And in doing this, we really do hope that we're able to unpack some of the complex social, cultural, political and economic dynamics at play, those that underpin the diversity and the richness of our region and shape the way that we view and engage with it. So tonight, we're looking at this topic, at this broad space again, and hopefully going to be challenging ourselves to think a little bit differently about where the Asia-Pacific features in our day-to-day discourse. It's no secret, of course, that Australia faces a critical juncture in the future direction of its engagement with Asia, but untangling Australia's position and place in the world and its domestic politics is a fraught exercise in the best of times. In 2022, that task becomes even harder as tensions are on the rise in our region and Australia faces an election that has a particularly security-focused edge. These days, no sphere is left untouched by foreign policy, not the arts, sport, science or education. As Australia faces more trade-offs and no easy answers, the public debate needs to play a more important role. But what do Australians think? Indeed, do they even care? So tonight we're joined by the fabulous Natasha Kassam, who's going to explore these issues for us. Natasha, as many of you would know, is the director of the Lowy Institute's Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program, directing the annual Lowy Institute poll and researching China politics, Taiwan and Australia-China relations. She's also a fellow of the ANU National Security College's Futures Council and a member of the advisory board for the University of Melbourne's Asia Law Centre. I should note she's a regular commentator in the media and just a fantastic person who brings enormous breadth of insight to the way that Australia is engaging with its region. Natasha, a great pleasure to welcome you to Perspectives Asia. And really pleased that you were able to kick us off for 2022. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and to Chris and to everybody for having me. It is such a pleasure to be doing this today. I wish it were in person, but for everybody watching at home, can I encourage you to go and see this incredible exhibition at APT 10, and I can't wait to get there myself. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on here today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and also from wherever you are today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about history and then get into where I think that finds us today. But ultimately, this is my pitch. This is my call to you, to the people, to the public, to get even more involved in foreign policy as we face these questions of our time. So until the 1940s, foreign policy was very much an elite concern, or so it might seem. I mean, this is counterintuitive, right? You think about the devastation and the bloodshed that characterized those decades in terms of foreign policy. You know, the idea of foreign policy for the people, by the people, it should have made sense, but it didn't really back then. Back then, it was very much, you know, a few storied men, and they were men, in the capitals making these decisions. Perhaps you had a man in Moscow, you know, somebody, a diplomat far away who was also making big decisions. But the idea of engaging the public, it was foreign at the time. What changes in the 1940s? You have the Gallup organization in the United States, and they start regularly polling the American people. This is the first time that American leaders have a much more direct sense of what the people thought and what the people wanted. FDR in particular is very attuned to public opinion. He has these regular meetings with political scientists. He really wants to understand what Americans care about and what they think about. And for most of World War II, he tries incredibly hard to work within the political space that he sees being created by public opinion. So what did the American people want in the 1940s? They wanted the Allies to win. They wanted the Nazis to lose. But more than any of that, they did not want the United States to be involved. Now, this changed over time, but the scars from World War I really governed the way in which Americans thought about that conflict. And you can see even back then that while public sentiment is not the only barometer for what is possible in elected office, of course, not by a long shot, there are many different factors going on. Leaders can use and abuse public opinion as they see fit. But it does play a really important role in terms of what is palatable or considered possible by leaders. Now, back in the same period, the situation in Australia was a little bit different. The development of public opinion polling and these organizations in the United States and also in the United Kingdom, it had an impact here, of course, as many things did at that time. But there was real concern in Australia from political elites about what it meant to have the public weigh in on the political process and whether they really wanted to relinquish any power in that way. Now, this might sound a little bit familiar. You know, as Caitlin outlined, I present the annual Lowy Institute poll, which looks at what Australians think about the world and has been doing for 17 years. Can I tell you that every time that I go to Canberra to present the results, to present my findings on what Australians think about the world, at least one person will say to me, well, what would they know? What would the public know? Every time I have the same answer where I say, well, is that their fault or is that yours? Whose responsibility is it to raise awareness of these issues in the community, in the people that vote? So back in the 1940s, the public in Australia was seen as unreliable or disengaged and essentially needed to be, and you know, this is what many leaders at the time thought, they needed to be guided down the right path on these issues and to provide the government with support for their policies. There was polling in Australia back then on a range of issues, but often it was only really taken up by the government for the most practical means, you know, to determine the needs for public housing after the war, for example. If you fast forward a little bit, you see a key point where this changes, and that's for the Australian government during the Vietnam War, where you see the war not only disrupted many traditional political dynamics in a number of countries, but you saw hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. You saw the way public opinion weighed in terms of what governments decided to do, and ultimately the decision to withdraw. Now, this really came back and forth in many different ways during this period. I mentioned FDR. He often would meet a political scientist before his fireside chat on the radio to try to engage with people and what they were thinking. By contrast, in 2002, during the anti-war protests in Australia, the Prime Minister, John Howard, said, "I don't know that you can measure public opinion just by a number of people who turn up at demonstrations. What I'm doing here, I think, is right for Australia. This is not something you read each opinion poll or measure by the number of people at demonstrations." Now, you could agree or disagree with him on that one. And I think it's important to caveat that there are plenty of examples of Australian leaders making decisions that are contrary to public opinion, and that clearly being the right thing to do, whether it be the decision about the refugee intake in this country after the Vietnam War, or the abolition of the death penalty, something that was unpopular at the time. It's not true that leaders are only guided by what the public thinks and what they want. I still do believe, more often than not, that the public gets these issues right. Where there is a gap of knowledge or an understanding, I don't think it takes that much work for the leadership to make a case and to take voters with them. And so what I want to put to you, to the public, is that we need you. We, anyone in the foreign policy community, we need you to play more of a role, to hold leaders to account, to weigh in on how Australia should defend its values and prosecute its interests at a time where things are only getting harder. Now, I accept it's not going to be easy, and there will be inconsistencies, particularly where values and interests run into each other. And it's not easy to have public attention on these issues. Alan Gingel, who was the founding director of the Lowy Institute where I work and also founded the annual poll that I direct, he said a couple of years ago, "It's true that short of wars, terrorist threats, and high-profile consular cases, most voters have little interest in the technicalities of foreign policy." Now, that's not surprising, he says. Foreign policy doesn't lend itself to clear storytelling. Much of its work is elusive and incremental, and it happens behind closed doors and over time. It's the work of persuasion. Now, I know better than to disagree with Alan Gingel, and I understand that for the longest time, foreign policy has been seen in a kind of separate remit to domestic politics. But what I want to argue today is that this is changing, and that these issues that loom larger in our day-to-day lives, they do not fit neatly in these categories of domestic and foreign policy. If you think about any contentious foreign policy issue today, climate change, immigration, trade, China, they all have domestic implications and consequences, and these lines cannot be so neatly drawn. Now, we could talk about climate change, a large policy failure in Australia's political history. And you think back to 2007, when Australia faced a federal election where both political parties came to the election with an emissions trading scheme. They both had seen the wave of opinion changing and the concern about the climate. They'd watched An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. John Howard says in his biography that the party revisited its position on environmental policies in response to the weight of public opinion. I said we could talk about that, but the way that that tracks continues to be a depressing story of wedge politics in inaction, despite overwhelming public opinion. There are better stories. For example, we've seen in many like-minded countries in recent years turning inwards. We've seen populism, we've seen protectionism, we've seen anxiety about the effect of globalization on these countries and what it means for their futures, for their livelihoods, for their relationship with the rest of the world. It's really interesting to me that Australians in that context have remained overwhelmingly positive about free trade. The same can't be said for immigration necessarily, but you can see that some of these global trends have not buffeted Australia in the same way. But the story that I always come back to see how the relationship between what Australians think and what Australia, the government, the nation has done in the world, I always come back to Australia-China. It is what I focus on. I lived in China for a long time. I worked for the government there. And so to me, it tells the neatest story of just how important the role of the public is, just how much power they hold, and how important it is to engage with them. To start this story, we have to look to the early 2000s, a time where Australia and many other countries looked to China as a newfound land of opportunity. The recovery from the Asian financial crisis is well underway, and Australia is having a conversation with itself about its place in the region. There is this seaside town called Boao in Hainan Island in the south of China. Some of you might have been there to attend the Boao Forum, which is an annual meeting where heads of state, business, academia, they come together to share views on economic issues. It's been described as Asia's answer to the World Economic Forum in Davos, basically Asia's Davos. It was started in 2001, and one of the founding members was Australia's own Bob Hawke. And in those early days, there was this mutual interest driving the arrangement. China was looking to the West for know-how to fix and upskill their state banks that were rife with corruption. Foreign bankers wanted to invest in the Chinese market. In that period, around 2004, 2005, 2006, billions of dollars went to Chinese state lenders. In 2008, Beijing hosted the Olympics, again happening today. But then it was this moment of national pride and a moment of international attention. It was 2008. Much of the developed world was falling into the global financial crisis. You go forward to the 2009 Boao Forum. The story looks a little bit different. The credit crisis had seen all of these bankers return to China, seeking Chinese cash to shore up their balance sheets. And from China's side, there was a decision, I think, not to project a conciliatory image, but rather a newfound confidence, a triumphalism in the air. And this is for good reason. From 2001 to 2008, the Chinese economy tripled in size. By 2008, China is Australia's largest trading partner. And as many Western countries that had built the institutions of the global economy faltered, there were many leaders in China who rightfully wondered whether there was anything left to learn from the West. So what I'm trying to illustrate at that point is not only is China becoming more powerful back then and seeing itself as more powerful, but countries like Australia looked at this as opportunities and markets and wide open plains. And the thing is, the concerns that are dominant in the relationship today around human rights, for example, they weren't invisible then. The Free Tibet movement, it was large in Australia. In the early 2000s, Falun Gong had only just been banned in China. Many had fled to Australia and other countries claiming that they were not being allowed to practice their religion or to express themselves freely. But the lure of the market, the golden glint in the eye, it very understandably meant that Australia forged ahead. And it forged ahead with this sense that we could keep human rights and security issues separate from economic issues. We could forge these two tracks. They could progress on different channels. We would find ways to proceed on both. It's very crude, but you could call it values and interests if you needed to. And never shall the two meet. You look back, for example, in October 2003, Australia's parliament heard on successive days China's leader Hu Jintao give a speech and George Bush the next day. You look at Australian public opinion back then, and there are such high levels of warmth towards China and towards the United States. If you ask Australians back then, who is your best friend in the world? They pick the United States, they pick China, they pick New Zealand, but they are close together. These countries are all seen as the most important partners to us. And this has continued for quite some time. Australia and China finds itself in the position it does today, the relationship in a very, very difficult place. But it's easy to forget that that has happened quite quickly. It's as recently as 2018, just 4 years ago, 8 in 10 Australians saw China as more of an economic partner rather than a security threat. The majority of Australians said that they trusted China to act responsibly in the world. The majority of Australians had confidence in Xi Jinping. It's pretty clear to most that the situation has changed and changed quite dramatically. the list of reasons for that is very long. The decision to exclude Huawei from Australia's 5G network, crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, the crippling of freedoms in Hong Kong, the targeted campaign of economic coercion against Australia. The list of bilateral irritants, it goes on, and it feels like there is a new issue in the relationship every day. But what I think we can see in between all of this is a recognition that a foreign policy approach that really characterized the better part of a decade, it was not sustainable. You could not have these separate tracks. You could not have politics over here and the economy over here. It wasn't ever going to work, but perhaps that's only become clearer recently. And particularly not in a country like Australia, where the public debate is loud. It's not always helpful, but it is that kind of an environment where these issues are debated and discussed and talked over. So maybe this is the reason that the foreign interference debates are some of the clearest examples in Australia, where you see that clashing of those two lines, where you see the kind of efforts of the Chinese state on the one hand and Australian politics on the other, and they come so sharply together. An example I often come back to is the Australia-China Extradition Treaty. In 2007, Australia signed a treaty with China, along with another treaty about the international transfer of prisoners. And then Australia did not ratify it. So these twin agreements were signed. The transfer of prisoners agreement was ratified. The extradition treaty was not. It kind of sat on the back burner for some time. I mean, this is 2007. This is pre-Xi Jinping, pre a lot of the issues that we see in China today. What happens in around 2012, 2013 is China commences on a very dramatic anti-corruption campaign. This is one of Xi Jinping's hallmarks, to try to make the Chinese state more responsive, both to the public and to the party, and to ensure that corruption didn't hinder the progress and reforms that were planned. As this happened, China realizes that there are economic fugitives, taking capital out of China and fleeing to a range of countries, including Australia. Suddenly, that extradition treaty that has been kind of on the shelf for quite a long time looks quite appealing. We can look at the memoirs of Malcolm Turnbull, for example, to see the efforts to which China pushed to try to have Australia ratify this extradition treaty, to the point that the government did bring it before Parliament and tried to make it happen. But what happens? This is an issue of foreign policy, an extradition treaty. But of course, it has domestic implications in Australia. Questions are being asked in our Parliament. Can we really extradite Australians to China? Can we even extradite Chinese nationals back to China? What do we know about the judicial system? What confidence do we have? What level of trust do we have in the way that these people will be treated? You see how these issues start to take on a domestic flavor. We're asking about standards and principles in another country, in another legal system. The separation, it doesn't work anymore. Of course, this gets much worse when there are news reports that a senior Chinese official has said to the members of the opposition in Australia that it would be a shame if we had to tell the Chinese community in Australia not to vote for Labor because of their opposition to this extradition treaty. Now, that gets us into a whole other area of the way in which foreign policy is intersecting with the domestic. When you look at questions of social cohesion, a country like Australia that calls itself the most successful multicultural nation in the world, it has 1.3 million Australians of Chinese heritage, many of which report feeling victimized by the state of the bilateral relationship. How can you again, try to manage these tracks, try to hold up your values, protect your interests, and hold on to social cohesion at home? It is incredibly difficult. I'm not trying to claim that it's easy, but what I'm trying to say is that these issues continue to interact and intersect, and we cannot try to unpack them in a way to focus on one issue, try to fix one without dealing with the other. We see this coming up over and over again in Australia in recent months. I participated recently in a wonderful festival called AusAsia that celebrates Asian Australia in art and in politics, but that it emerges that perhaps they've tried to limit some of the political messages of a dance troupe that dance in promotion of Hong Kong's values and freedoms. It was, a lot of different things were going on there. But you see that this starts to attract domestic public attention because there is an idea that potentially, and I'm not saying that this is actually what happened, but potentially there are efforts to censor in Australia to please a foreign government. You see it again just in the last few weeks with the Australian Open, as the organisers grapple over how to handle a political campaign on behalf of a tennis player that many were concerned about had been silenced following allegations of abuse. You see how these international issues, they come to rest at home in the way in which we go about our daily lives, and in these areas that you don't expect to interact with foreign policy, in the arts, in sport. I'm talking a lot about China, but of course it's not just China. We've just seen a large-scale boycott of many Sydney Festival events because of a relationship of funding with the Israeli government. Now, what I'm trying to suggest is, in this more complex and fractured kind of environment, these issues are just going to loom larger and larger, and the public's involvement on those questions, it's just so incredibly important. What you see coming up again and again with the extradition treaty, with the Australian Open, it's questions about human rights. I'm not trying to advocate that Australia be consistent in its application of values all of the time. I understand, even if I do not like, that the defense of values can come into tension with advancing interests, and Australia faces a more complex world where it's going to be much harder to navigate our way in a way that is secure and in a way that protects other states and their right to move and their freedom from coercion. Maybe one way to think about this is if you think about it as a practitioner. So when I was a junior diplomat in Beijing, I worked a lot on human rights issues. And think about it in this way. Maybe you have a meeting with a Chinese official. Your brief will go across the whole remit of the bilateral relationship. So the businesses that have various requests, the law enforcement cooperation, the agriculture deal that maybe you're striking. There's literally issues across the whole relationship that is captured in the complexity of what Australia and China do together. But then you also have the human rights issues that must be raised, that you have to bring up. You're not sure it's going to make a difference, but maybe it will be asked about at Senate estimates. Maybe it will become a political issue down the track. Maybe somebody, a journalist, writes a story and says, when is the last time that you raised how Falun Gong is being treated in China? These are all the issues they're trying to weigh up, and that's just one tiny example of what the government is trying to do all the time. I'm not defending the government, but I also recognize that it's not easy to do all of these things and to do them effectively. I'm biased, of course. I worked at DFAT for a long time, but the diplomats will always have my sympathy. And they are always facing the demand of the government that employs you, the public you serve, the values you hold, and those can come into conflict, even on that micro scale. So I'm not trying to point to Australia's shortcomings to distract or silence criticism of foreign nations. I mean, it's the opposite from my perspective. Part of wanting the public to weigh in more on these issues is because I want more criticism of those who censor, those who limit speech, and those who surveil. I want there to be sanctions on human rights abuses and to do nothing else but talk about these atrocities and what we can do to make it better for these people. But what I do think we could think more seriously about here at home, and what I think would be maybe a result of more of a public debate into our foreign policy, is that we could be more effective, we could be more compelling and more persuasive if we acknowledge and ideally try to improve on our own shortcomings as well. I keep coming back to some comments that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, made at a meeting with his Chinese counterparts in Alaska last year. He said, there's one more hallmark of our leadership here at home, and that's a constant quest, as we say, to form a more perfect union. And that quest, by definition, acknowledges our imperfections, acknowledges we're not perfect, we make mistakes, we have reversals, we take steps back. But what we've done throughout our history is to confront those challenges openly, publicly, transparently, not trying to ignore them, not trying to pretend they don't exist, not trying to sweep them under the rug. And sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's ugly, but each and every time we have come out stronger, better, and more united as a country. Now, I don't know how well the United States is achieving on those goals. You can trust me when I say it's rare for me to want to quote a Secretary of State. But I see too little of this at home. I see too much of a focus on the human rights of other countries. Well, not too much, as I say, I want more of that, but not enough of a focus on how we could be doing better here. I truly believe that recognizing and acknowledging Australia's struggles as we interact in this new environment, we look at our struggles with our Indigenous history, with multiculturalism, with gender equality, and on so many other fronts, I think it would make a more compelling case when we push others to do better. Australia's last significant foreign policy document was the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. Full disclosure, I was a part of the drafting team. But the first chapter is dedicated to the idea that foreign policy in Australia starts at home. It starts in our values, our resilience, our economy, our community. These are the starting points for our international engagement and for the place that we play in the world. And I believe bringing the public along for that conversation, for the good, the bad, the wins, the failures, that's in our national interest. And as I've tried to illustrate, I don't think it's possible to step away from it. I do think that these issues of foreign policy, these questions of values and human rights, they intersect with our everyday lives in so many ways now that there's no point in trying to keep them separate. And in fact, there's something to be gained in bringing it together. I look at the incredible array of artists at APT 10. I see the countries in our region that we can learn from and that we can share with. We can learn from Taiwan about Indigenous representation in Parliament. We can share with Fiji our journey in Australia towards gender equality and how far we know we still have to go. We can look at the Pacific Alliance and think about all the Pacific Islands that are holding elections this year and how, despite some of these issues, Australia's institutions, such as our Electoral Commission, they're some of the strongest in the world. I'm going to shamelessly steal from Ruha Fafita, one of the curators from APT 10, who said recently on a podcast at the Lowy Institute, we need to see ourselves as co-creators of the future that comes afterwards. And the creative process, understanding it, has a really important role to play in the building of resilience. Many in Australia worry that we will have what they call a khaki-tinged election in Australia this year. The idea that foreign policy could become a battering ram for either party on which to score political points. Both sides will try to brandish their national security credentials, and we're all the poorer for it. I see that concern, I share that concern, but I also see an opportunity at a time when democracy is backsliding. Many question whether our system can manage the challenges that we face. The election is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for voters to learn more about the region that we find ourselves in, to hear from their would-be elected representatives on the significant questions of our time, and ultimately to make a choice about Australia, about what we stand for and the place that it holds in the world.
Natasha, so fabulous to hear from you tonight. That was a truly engaging and really powerful beginning to our Perspectives Asia series. So thank you. You've I think, given us not just a call to action, but actually challenged us to look at ourselves in so many different ways. And I know when I was recently looking at the last Lowy poll, one of the things that came through was that we tend to hold a very rosy view of ourselves whilst we look out through this window to the world. And, you know, I think you've really hit on this point that, in fact, so much of what you're talking about, engaging with ideas of foreign policy, are actually engaging with the ideas of who we are, what we stand for, what kinds of institutions we want to have, but even more fundamentally, how we behave and interact with each other, which is a really, in many ways, I think, a very challenging and confronting place to be. And kudos to you for bringing that conversation to us tonight. I've got a bunch of questions, but I know we've got questions coming through from the audience, and those of you who are in the audience, I forgot to mention this a little bit earlier, but there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We would love to have your questions, and it's great to have Natasha here to speak to them as well. So the first couple of questions that have come through have really focused in on the role of the media Peter Ambrose has asked whether the media has played a responsible role in some of this. Could they do better? And I'm going to merge that as well with a question that's come from Tess Newton-Kane, who leads our Pacific Hub at the Griffith Asia Institute, who's asked what role or even responsibility is there for the media, but also for others, schools and universities, for building the literacy of the Australian public. And giving an example, linguistic and cultural skills are lacking amongst practitioners, commentators, and policymakers. Where is the evidence that this is recognised and that meaningful efforts are being made to address this? So, two big questions. Let me hand over to you.
Those are big questions and they're great ones. Perhaps it was a little unfair of me to put too much responsibility on the government to be doing more on this front. And, you know, I think it's very fair to highlight the role of the media in all of this. I think I probably need to come down on both sides on this. I think on the one hand, our media, I think, does better than it has in a long time in terms of, you know, we have Australian correspondents all over the world. They are reporting regularly on these issues and trying to bring these issues to an Australian audience. If I think about in 2013, I moved overseas to China. When I moved back 5 years later, it was so funny because as I left, people were like, why are you going to China? What's that going to be about? Well, what's the point? Why are you learning Mandarin? By the time I got back, there was a front page story about China every day in Australia. You know, it had become a part of a national conversation in a way that it just wasn't when I left. Now, we could argue that that's not a good thing. And as I say, there's another side to it. I'm really sympathetic to the news media because they, like many industries, are required to get clicks. They are shrinking, they have limited bandwidth. You know, we try to cover the whole world with what, like 9 Australian foreign correspondents. It's an incredibly difficult job. And often the story that will sell is going to win over the story that takes the effort and the literacy and the expertise. So I have sympathies for it. Having said all of that, we can obviously do better. We can do better in so many ways. The Anglosphere, for lack of a better word, the English-speaking world is over-reported in this country, and countries where perhaps English is not as dominant is so underreported. And again, I'm sympathetic to the barriers to entry, but as so many people know, this is where we live and this is where we are. You know, 1 in 3 Australians were born somewhere else. I think a new generation of Australians see themselves very much as a part of Asia, and that isn't necessarily reflected in our press. So I think that there is much more work to do. I think we've come a long way. One example I would give is, you know, I run surveys on what Australians of Chinese heritage think about the state of the world right now. If you asked them 18 months ago what they thought about Australian media reporting, the vast majority said that the reporting on China is too negative and it really lacks balance. What we've seen in the last year is a shift, I think. So the community is by about 12 points, more likely now to say that the Australian media are reporting on China in a more fair way. And so I think we can see particular outlets learning from the way in which they've represented some of these issues. And, you know, to Tessa's question in particular, I think it's important to note that in Australia, we talk quite a lot about the idea of particularly the Pacific as our family. We hear this from the leaders all the time. I'm not sure we get to decide who our family is in that sense. I don't think you get to tell people that they're their family. I think you need to show up, you need to do the work, we need to learn more and listen more. I think it's a long way to go, and I don't have the answers, but I do think part of that conversation is to, you know, take these opportunities. Like I said, you know, both sides of politics are going to go to this election with a foreign policy platform that in 2019 we did not hear a word. You know, we did not get to hear any of it. There was no foreign policy debate in the last federal election. But what are both sides of politics' view for our interactions with the Pacific, who again we call our family, but do they call us that? What are the visions for the aid budget, for example? What do they want to do with it? I haven't even seen, significant progress on migration targets or what that would look like. And it's been a strange world. I think we can be understanding in COVID times, but yeah, I see these as opportunities to do better on all of those fronts.
And I'd like to, just make the comment there. You mentioned the fact that that our media, it does a good job with what's available. And it was really interesting. I think the Lowy Interpreter covered Ross Tapsel's recent article around coverage of COVID, and the fact that, in fact, our coverage of COVID was overwhelmingly from the US and the UK. But there was so very little about what's happening in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And that, as just one little area of news, is so tells us a lot about how engaged we are with a whole lot of issues taking place in the region.
And I completely agree. I mean, there were two things I just quickly want to say about that. The Ross Tapsell article, where it identified how much we drew on English-speaking countries' experience during COVID. I haven't done the research, but I would feel very confident in making the claim that the same could be applied to almost any issue. It's not COVID specific, right? It's just the way, in Australia, you're going to hear this year far more about a race for governor in a state of the United States than you are about the elections in Papua New Guinea. Like, that's what's going to happen, and we know that's going to happen. People are going to name mayoral candidates in New York before they are the prime minister of Papua New Guinea or the president of Indonesia. And part of that is about that coverage issue. And yeah, it's a real limitation. It's a real gap.
We do have a question from Lou Cabrera. I'm going to get to that in just 1 second. Before we do go there, you mentioned in your presentation that you were part of the drafting team for the Foreign Policy White Paper, and that was a much needed foreign policy white paper. We needed some narrative and direction, and it was widely welcomed. I, in particular, was very interested in the very final chapter of that, the chapter that related to soft power, the way that we exercise influence through the instruments of persuasion. How do you think we've done there? And I say this recognizing the amazing work, can I say again, of Kwagoma with significant institutions like the APT. But overall, how have we done?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to think about it, because there are definitely areas that I see as high points, and arts and culture, I think, is somewhere where Australia, I was about to say punches above its weight, I can't stand that expression, but does, has outsized influence in our region. There are a lot of things that are incredibly appealing about Australia. Even now, even with the tensions with China, if you run a survey in China today, Australia will be number one on countries where people want to study, number two on countries where people want to travel. So there are kind of natural assets that are being deployed in this way. Now, that chapter of the white paper, it talked more about, harnessing the resources that we have. It talked about diasporas. It talked about the ways in which Australia can bring all of these different elements to bear on our foreign policy. Now, I cannot say that I think we've done that particularly well. Again, I want to be sympathetic, because I think COVID has been a curveball that has really crippled a lot of efforts. Look at us today doing this virtually instead of in an incredible art gallery. So, I do have sympathy for that. But even in that context of COVID, you have, what I would argue is Australia not doing enough to provide vaccines, to work with COVAX, to be out there on the multilateral stage. In the space that we have, I think Australia could be doing more. And I just remembered the other point that I was going to make, which is that around the way in which Australian media have been reporting on COVID issues, I mean, even just this week, I feel like I've heard far, far more about Sweden, the United Kingdom, and Austria, and nothing about COVID crises unfolding in Solomon Islands and Tonga, just as an example. And, these are things that are so important to Australia that Australia is actually, I think, trying to assist with, but we're still not hearing about it in our discourse.
And actually, I know the Lowy Institute does a really great job in providing commentary on those issues. Can I give a plug again for the Griffith Asia Institute, Tess Newton-Kane, delivering the Pacific commentary, the Pacific Outlook, and Savinda Poi, one of our PhD students, who does a fortnightly wrap on Southeast Asian issues. So if you haven't seen those folks, tune in, please, and you'll get the latest on what's making news in our region. But let me go to the questions that are coming up here. We've got one from my colleague Lou Cabrera, who makes the point. Pew conducted a survey of 14 high-income democracies for the UN's 75th anniversary report in 2020. It found that Australians, more than people in any other country, said that their country should reject international compromise when its own interests are at stake. Based on your experience with surveys, can you shed on any light on why the Australian public might be so far out in front on that kind of a my country first attitude?
Well, Pew does incredible work, and I thought that was a really interesting and fascinating survey. One of the issues that we grapple with as people who write these surveys and then try to analyze them is everybody reads something different when they receive such a question, and we can't always know exactly what people are thinking. Now, 2020 in Australia is when you have our Prime Minister giving a speech on negative globalism at the Lowy Institute, right? And he's talking about the ideas that there are these unaccountable global institutions that are trying to hold Australia and others to account. If I was reading between the lines, I would say this was about climate change, right? And the idea that countries have come together to make commitments, but those countries were not elected, right? By those institutions were not elected, and these, governments are accountable to their own people. Now, that line, I think, was quite successful in Australia, but I think it depends on how you ask the question. So in 2020, at the same time as that United Nations survey, I ran a question in the Lowy Institute poll where I asked Australians, if we had to choose between reaching international compromise or like putting our own interests first, and we got a pretty similar result. More Australians say that we should always be putting our interests first. But if you say, for example, that the global cooperation really failed during COVID-19, should there have been more global cooperation or less? Overwhelmingly, Australians say there should have been more. We wanted more multilateralism. We wanted more working together. So that's a long way of saying I think the context is really important. I think in the Australian case, there is a little bit of a chip on our shoulder, long-standing, where we're always the little brother in most relationships. We see ourselves as somewhat begging for attention. And so when it comes to the idea of compromise in the international system, a lot of Australians, I think that we shouldn't have to do that. We already have to compromise so much in our international relationships. We have to stump up more than we think is worth. And you see this across a whole range of different issues where there is kind of a reluctance, I think, to put the needs of the international community ahead of our own. Now, on a personal level, do I find that a bit disappointing? Yes, I do. But again, this is, I think, something that can be shifted, and in particular contexts can be shifted. I'll give you one quick example before I wrap up. If you ask Australians what they think about foreign aid, this is the bane of my existence. The vast majority will always say we should spend less on foreign aid. We spend too much on foreign aid. It doesn't matter how much it is. If you say, should we spend 0.1% of our GDP on foreign aid? They'll say, no, it's too much. If you say, how much do you think we spend? They say 10%, but that's too much as well. It's people don't understand these spendings and they find it to be too much regardless of what it is. If you say, in a very specific case, should we pay to send COVID-19 vaccines to Pacific Island countries? 85% will say yes, right? Should we contribute to this very specific thing and spend money on it where we will do a good thing for someone else? People will say yes. Should we lead the way on reaching agreement at Paris or at Copenhagen at one of these climate change conferences? People will say yes. So my very long way of answering this is it depends how you ask, but in the abstract, Australians, I think, are generally going to say we should put our interests first, but we're actually a bit more empathetic and want to be global citizens when we're faced with a specific circumstance where we can contribute.
That's a really great, you've just given us all a fabulous piece of policy advice there, I think, and in terms of communicating and advocating for policy. push the abstract to one side and get specific, really think in concrete terms. So that's something I'll be taking away from this. We've got another question here from Christian Wells, who's asked, and I think this is actually exactly to the point you've just made. What foreign policy issues, if we get to the concrete and tangible, will be the main focus of the major parties in the upcoming federal election? And do you see that there will be major points of differentiation between the two?
This is such a great question. I've been thinking really hard about this because, in my opinion, if you look at the last couple of weeks in political debate, you have, I think, an effort by the government to effectively wedge Labor on national security issues. And the response, which I mean is pretty smart, has been to come back and say, we're totally bipartisan. We agree with you on everything. There is no wedge here. That is, I think, politicking. In terms of actual substantial issues, where are there going to be differences? I don't think that they're going to be, gaping chasms, but what I do see is on immigration, I think we could have a discussion about what our post-COVID immigration world looks like in Australia. What is the makeup of that program? How much of it is humanitarian? How much of it is skilled? I think we're seeing signals that there will be some contention and some difference between the two. We've seen some specific cases of pledges, for example, from the opposition of where they're going to make exceptions and grant humanitarian visas to particular people who have been in limbo for some time in Australia. So I think we can see the potential for immigration to be a gap. I don't think it will be in the size of the programs, but maybe in the composition of that program. And also it's a little bit hard to say given, we've had negative population growth for the past couple of years because of COVID. I think one of the obvious gaps is probably climate. And, I'm not a specialist on that, but this is, I think, a challenge because you've got about 70% of Australians that are overwhelmingly in favour of doing more on climate. And you've got kind of that hard 30% that are still feeling quite strongly about coal and are not necessarily ready for a future where our largest partners in Asia are carbon neutral by 2050 or 2060. So I think that's going to be a little bit of an issue and one that the government will be keen to play down because they're also being challenged by independents who I think have very similar policy platforms to them, but with more of a climate agenda. So that's another issue where I see a difference. I think that we'll see both sides trying to be quite bipartisan on China. But where there might be some fraying are the foreign interference stories. And of course, we're hearing about another one of those just today after the ASIO report last night. I think that it will be hard to create a wedge on that particular issue, but that doesn't mean people won't try. And then the last one I would just say is I think defence spending, AUKUS, and the nuclear safeguards question kind of all wrapped up into one. I think that the government is kind of already out there on increasing defence spending and spending quite a lot of money on AUKUS and having nuclear powered submarines. We have what I would call lukewarm support from the opposition. And I'm not suggesting that they would come to an election with like a big agenda to change that, but because of that level of qualified support for what is being hailed as a hallmark foreign policy decision for Australia, there's the possibility for some space between them on that question. I think those are the ones I'd be paying the most attention to.
Yeah. I still have so many questions, but we've only got a few minutes to go, Natasha and I, and you've been so generous with your time. But can we talk about China? How do you see, and I think this came out very clearly in the Lowy poll last year, and your work working with Chinese Australians, that there is a clear differentiation between the political issues and the political realm and Australia's engagement with Chinese culture, language, China studies. We at Griffith have a really strong legacy of engaging with China and a strong expertise in China studies. How do we navigate the many and layered complexities that are bound up in this relationship?
It's incredibly difficult for the reasons that you say. And I'm not convinced that I have the answers on that particular question. This is what I think that from my perspective, the things that we can try to do. I think clarity in the way we speak about whom we're speaking and what we're talking about is so important. There is a risk, perhaps in media and in other commentary, to amplify the idea of a threat from China, for example. Now, I don't think anyone could accuse me of not being anything but quite hawkish about some of the risks and threats that we face, but being specific about what they are. What are we concerned about? How does it affect us? And why do we think that there's a reason to engage on that issue? Who is responsible for it on the Chinese side, insofar as we know? Are we talking about the government and the party as opposed to Chinese people, or other elements of culture and history? I think that kind of clarity can really help us. I think here at home, we can't just talk about multiculturalism, but we have to live it and be it. One of the things that I find kind of frustrating is every now and again, you have someone senior come out and say, now I want all of you Chinese Australians to feel like you're at home here. And it's like you and there, and you are here in our place. And there's this division that, makes me feel quite icky also as, a kind of immigrant to Australia. Understanding that, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but we do have incredible institutions in this country, even if our media could do better sometimes, even if our government could do better sometimes. And part of that means, I think, the ability to have a broad range of views in this country. One of the things my research in the Chinese Australian communities finds is, there's much more warmth and positivity towards China in those communities than in the broader Australian population. Now, some people might find that concerning, but I think that in Australia, we can take it. We have lots of dual nationals. We have lots of people who identify with a lot of different places, and they're going to have different views, and that's okay. That isn't something we need to be scared of. So yeah, for me, I think those are some of the things that I try to keep in mind. I think it's for somebody like me, and clearly you, where you have a history of engaging with China, it was my home for a long time and I love it dearly. It's very hard to try to figure out how to have those relationships in this particular environment, but we have to try.
Do you know, Natasha, it's just been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I think you've really highlighted the need for us to be able to engage in constructive conversations. Too often when we talk about foreign policy, we really are polarized, and we come at issues from extremes, and there's just so much space in between and so much room for different perspectives. It's been just, again, a real delight. Let me now invite Chris Ames to the virtual podium to deliver the vote of thanks. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. And Natasha, I think all of us gathered in this meeting can't thank you enough. You began by saying that what you wanted to do was to give us a real pitch about why the public should get engaged in and better understand through that engagement the work of foreign policy and how it affects and relates to domestic policy particularly. And I think from your passion, the experience you bring to the talk that you gave us and responses to the questions put to you, and really, if there are conviction politicians, there are conviction advocates and champions, I think, for their cause, and you've really given us that tonight. I was struck as I listened to the talk, and there were lots of things it sent me off scuttling doing in the margins, including looking at my phone for a couple of things that you just triggered. And one of them was the issue of the way in which you talked about that intersection of foreign and domestic policy often gathers around particular areas like extradition, which I thought was an incredibly powerful example that I hadn't honestly in recent years thought much about. But then the Peng Shui event, of course, at the Australian Open was a really good example of the way those things can so powerfully converge from 3 T-shirts in a stadium to a clampdown, removal by security. And I didn't think there'd be this volte-face from Australian tennis, but there was. And within a day, because of media, and I think particularly the commentary underlying a lot of media articles, I think that's what changed that policy overnight. So that was really interesting. And you're right, issues that are really occurring in the foreign space often come to roost in the domestic space, and very powerfully so. The other thing, looking at my phone, not because I was bored, but because I read a couple of things at lunchtime that really you immediately called on, really, in the talk you gave us tonight in the Australian feed. And this is looking at the homepage. The very first article, China aims to dominate the world, Blinken. And you mentioned Blinken not just in the context of the current visit and the meeting with Maurice Payne today, but of course, what happened in Iceland when China and America kind of faced off across the steps, as it were. And then 3 of the 6 articles opening that newspaper feed tonight, the second of them was Beijing has chosen Labor for election, Dutton. Well, okay, no surprise there. There's a great example of your political wedge you talked about. And I thought of the articles, of the 3 of the current 6, back Taiwan, block China from trade pact. I thought that absolutely is an article worth reading because it talks about a lot of the things that really lie at the intersection of the topics you've raised with us tonight. If we go harder on China in terms of a trade deal with Taiwan, will that achieve what Australia needs to achieve to kind of either work with or stare down the current trade embargo, really, that's been imposed on a great deal of Australian goods and services provided to China? So there was just so much to deal with and so much to react to. And I know I speak for everyone on this call when I say how much we've appreciated your time, your insight, and more than anything, your passion for this topic. So on behalf of Caitlin and myself, of course, the Australia Centre of Asia Pacific Art here at Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, and of course, the Griffith Asia Institute, we're delighted to have you online, delighted to have this conversation, and look forward to welcoming you hopefully soon to Brisbane, and I think a long-promised tour of the APT. Thanks very much to everyone. Thank you for your coming into the call tonight. I think it's been a really great discussion. And Perspectives Asia, thank you for your participation in this event. Good night, and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, Natasha. Just fabulous. And thank you, Chris.
Thank you both.